So first of all, it's a real pleasure to actually get to speak in Estonia. So for those who may have known me, I do quite a lot of speaking globally. And one thing that kind of was resonate, just to give you a little bit of history about why we're doing the conference, was that as I was going around the world giving these conferences, I was speaking to some local people in Estonia, which is where I live. So I live in Estonia for the last 14 years. And they said, there's no real conferences like this in Estonia. Why don't you do something more here? So at that point in time, we decided to really look at taking the best of the conferences that I attend globally and bring it here to Tallinn, bring it closer to yourselves so more people can get the experience, enjoyment, and ability to go to these conferences. We really focus the conferences on more educational side. So to make sure that you're actually getting and achieving that today so that you actually learn something new and something that you actually allow you to develop your careers. So TopConf and Tallinn Cyber Conf is really here. It's here to provide you valuable information to really help not only you in your workplace be safe, but also in your personal lives. Because at the end of the day, cybercrime doesn't really decide on whether it's going to attack your work or attack your home or your children. It has no basically racial distinction or any type of age distinction. It will actually just attack whoever gets the first compromise. So therefore, the reason why is to help provide you an overall protection, get you safe globally. So to give you some information today, just to give you a little bit of the agenda before we get started, is that we just had the opening words from Chris, and then myself will be on for the next roughly 45 minutes. Then we'll break for a coffee break, and then we're going to split the rooms into two. So we'll actually have these split into two. And then one track is more of a kind of management side of track, and another one is a little bit more technical track. We'll have Jessica on just after the break, who's going to be speaking about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Then we'll have Marcus, and then we've got Jessica Otto, and then we'll have also Kalev as well. And then after this, we'll break for lunch. So we'll have 4 sessions, 2 different rooms in the morning side. After lunch, we'll break, and then we'll have another 2 tracks in here with Amar Singh, which is another great speaker to have coming to Estonia. And UNIT. Just to note a little bit of housekeeping that these 2 tracks here, myself and Michael have decided to switch. So just to note that Michael will be on at 1:10 and I will be on at 2:10. So just to note that we will have the website updated just to reflect that. Okay, then we'll actually have another break, and then we got another few sessions in the afternoon. Then we have a panel discussion. The panel discussion is really to provide one is I will be the moderator, so I'm going to basically provide the panelists with some probably very obscure and provocative questions. No, I'm not going to be that bad. But I will give them some questions to kind of move things along. But then we'd like to open it up to yourselves in the audience to allow you questions that you may have received or had in your mind throughout the day to really give the ability to ask the panel some questions that you may like to get a specific or type of answer on. Okay? And then we'll have a closing few words from Adrian at the end of the day. So moving on, one of the things I want to make sure is that it's important to really get an understanding about what's happening in the world, all the things that are going on. So the first session is really to give you an overall view on the cyber threat landscape. What's happening, what companies are experiencing, what trends are going on, what threats are out there, and to give you a better overview of what's coming. So, just to give you an idea about a little bit about myself, I've been in the industry now for more than 25 years. So I've been doing this quite a long time. And for 14 of those, I've spent here in Estonia. However, again, most of my work and activities and conferences and speaking and engagements are international. So in the past year, I've done over 100,000 miles in planes. So I spent at least about 4 weeks sitting on a plane last year. I met hundreds of customer meetings globally, from all the way from West Coast US to Asia, north and south the equator, 30 webinars and panel speakings, 30 plus countries in the last quarter, 10 white papers, which one was released yesterday. I released a report on the growth of passwords, and then also an advisory to maritime and critical infrastructure. So I get to go around and I get to meet a lot of companies, and I get a lot of feedback, and I get a lot of valuable information. And the reason for that is that as I do that, I want to bring it back and share it with you. so that you don't have to go and do 100,000 miles to spend all that time away, that you get that in a session today so that you'll actually be able to experience some of that. And these are just some of the notable conferences that I go and speak at globally. So first of all, to kind of really give you a perspective on what's happening in the world. So last year, in 2016, so just a little bit of recap into what happened last year. So last year, a large portion of the actual breaches were resulting from things like weak passwords, weak access controls. 63%, and if you look at whatever analyst report you look at, between 60 and 80%, a lot of the breaches were actually resulting from people, from mistakes that we make, from the human side of things. It's not always technology. It's not always that people are not doing enough innovation, enough implementation. Ultimately, most of the breaches occur because of the human factor, because of our inconsistencies, our mistakes. So it's always important to know that one of the most important from a security perspective is the human. It's the person who's sitting behind the keyboard, it's the person who's doing the installation, the person configuring, and the person managing. That's one of the most things that's important to realize, that technology isn't always the solution that's going to solve everything. You have to involve the people, okay? The next thing that's really significant is that last year we had one of the record years in history of record disclosures and records been stolen. Last year, actually in 2015, just to give you a bit of perspective, it was around 500 million records that were publicly disclosed and noted. Last year, we had over 3 billion. So 3 billion accounts were stolen last year in 2016. Okay, that's 95 credentials and passwords been stolen every second. It's about 8.2 million per day. And what's the population of Estonia? 1.4 million. So you think about every single day, a country almost 5 times the size of Estonia, or a country 5 times Estonia population, is having their passwords and credentials stolen. Every single day. As I've been speaking here, there's probably been about 1,000 passwords already been stolen, and credentials that are actually being used and actually disclosed on the internet. We've also seen, of course, the rise of advanced threats, and we'll talk a little bit, in some of those scenarios later. 8 countries last year listed cyber threats as the highest threat to their economy. They're seeing it as the biggest threat to actually global economies. So that not only is things like immigration and the change in the politics, but also cybercrime is actually listed as the biggest threat to economies. And a lot of those we've seen play out in 2016, where we've had a lot of countries having conflicts over things like, of course, voting systems and trade deals, and also the likes of, massive economical advantages like ship deals and military and so forth. And all of those have had some influence or some impact that cybercrime has tried to influence them, to steal the records, to steal the blueprints, to find out what the bids are, to influence outcomes. So countries are seeing this as a major impact, and therefore it's now listed in one of their top priorities to address moving forward. And then also 75% of small organizations get impacted. Every time I go to a small business, most cases they've already been compromised. But do you know what? The small business typically isn't the target. They're not the actual threat. Many times I hear when I speak to people, they say, oh, I'm too small to be important. I'm too small to be not noticed. No one's going to target me. Why would anyone want my information? But in fact, what happens is if you're able to actually breach the small business, you're able to use that as a stepping stone to get into the larger companies that they actually work with, the larger contracts, the larger companies that have more financial influence. And if you use those small businesses to access and get through those supply chain, it allows you then to actually act as that small business. And those larger companies cannot tell the difference between a cyber criminal who's using those trusted credentials versus actually a real person, a real actually trusted employee. So that's one of the significant areas as well. And that's why small businesses are one of the most targeted, is because it allows those stepping stones to get into the bigger corporations. And also ransomware. I can't tell you how many times I've been hitting ransomware time and again last year. Last year, it's approximately going to be a $1 billion cybercrime business. So cyber criminals who are actually creating and distributing ransomware, it's now becoming a very profitable business for them, and very effective as well. Now, ransomware has been around for many years, it's only become more effective and more impactful because of the sensitivity that they're targeting. They're targeting information that has very critical time-sensitive results. And also with the time-sensitive that if you don't pay the ransom within an amount of time, therefore your data is lost. So it gets into that critical thinking and stressful and also decision-sensitive that many companies globally have actually paid the ransom to get the actual data back. At the same time, there's no guarantee. The interesting ones in recent, I don't know if you saw in the past few weeks, that there was a ransomware that said that if you pass it on to 2 other people, we'll give you the key. So now you become the actual participation in the cybercrime. Because if you want to get your data back, you have to go and infect 2 other people. And then recent ones that came out was around things like where if you actually take an online security training course, they would actually give you the key to get your data back. So really pushing people to actually self-educate in hygiene. So some of the recent variations have been quite interesting. Some, of course, for good intentions, even though they're very highly impactful, and some, of course, significantly related to threatening. So one thing is every single day I always get, I can't tell you now that it's only the beginning of the year and it's February already, the amount of news reports that I've had to read. I do a lot of contribution to media and journalism globally, and I have to read every single articles that comes out, whether it being the reports on Trump, whether it being the intelligence reports and so forth, and I have to do all the reading to understand and make sure that I can actually analyze them. But it gets really, the amount of breaches that we now have on a daily basis is almost getting to a point where I can't even manage it myself. I can't have enough time in the day to read the reports on breaches. So that's a significant showing that the breaches are occurring more frequently. Now, just give a kind of hands up in the room who's probably experienced a breach in 2016. Anyone willing to admit it? Who's had a breach? I've had one. Another one in the back's had one. So we've had 2 people in this room who's had a breach in the past year. Okay. Who uses Dropbox? Who has a Yahoo account? Who has a LinkedIn account? Okay. All of you have put your hands up, have had a breach. Whether you have a direct impact or not, your data has been actually part of a compromise that has been disclosed. And that's one of the important things is that as I hear and speak to people throughout the year, that people don't see the relationship. They don't see how the impact it has to them because sometimes they don't see the monetary issue. They don't see that their personal data that's been disclosed has any risk to themselves, and they don't see the actual value. The interesting thing is when a hacker looks at your information, they say dollars and euros. They see money. When you look at your information, you see no value. You see that's okay. There's nothing specific behind it. But when other people get it, they can actually make money out of your information. Why do you think Facebook and Google and other social networks are giving you access and asking you to add more and more information? Because there's value in the data that you create. And that's important. And one of the things I really liked about last year was when David Kotka said that data will now become the 5th pillar of the European Union. And I think that's a significant statement. That's something that we should all take, that the freedom of data is a very important pillar, and therefore we should take it more seriously. We should actually see that there is value in data, and therefore we know that when data is compromised, we take it more seriously. So last year, of course, we saw the Tesco breach at the end of the year. Now, just to give you a bit of perspective, who in this room knows about the General Data Protection Regulation? Okay, it's getting better. Still a way to go. But if you're not familiar with the General Data Protection Regulation, what it does is basically if you have a data breach and you fail to notify or you fail to have adequate security and so forth, you become liable for the breach itself. And the actual financial penalty or sanctions or the penalty that would be in place, the fine, is going to be 4% of annual turnover. So what do you think that if Tesco's breach happened after the General Data Protection Regulation was in place, what do you think that Tesco's would have to pay in regards to the fine? Does anyone have a number?
20 million.
A little bit in the high end, but we're getting close. To give you an idea, so TalkTalk paid a fine of their breach was about £400,000. Okay? Tesco's breach, if we took the same scenario, it had, of course, 20,000 customers had some financial loss of it was about 2.5 million. But if you actually take into Tesco's bank as part of Tesco's group or Tesco's holdings, and the actual fine would be against the parent company, and therefore the fine of 4% annual turnover, not profit, but global annual turnover, would actually make Tesco's actually at risk to a 2 billion euro fine. Just to give you a bit of perspective, okay? Also, of course, we had the Dropbox. And I think Dropbox is significant because one of the things we don't realize is that for a long period of time, cyber criminals had access to your Dropbox accounts if you hadn't changed your password in a long time. And therefore, the ability that they had access to whatever data was in your Dropbox. So you have to assume that if you were actually exposed as part of that period of time, you have to assume that any data that you had in a Dropbox folder is now actually somewhere outside of your Dropbox on the internet. So you also have to think about, when access is made, that what actually data is behind it, what's the potential risk. And of course, we saw that one of the most famous ones, and this probably exaggerated the statistics a little bit for last year. We had Yahoo's famous breach, well, of course, 2 famous breaches. We had the 500 million user accounts. And then also, shortly after them, they would find out, actually, it's more like, we also had a second one, which had 1 billion. That represented 1 out of 7 people on this earth that were impacted just by the Yahoo breach. 1 in 3 people using the internet were impacted by this breach. 1 in 3 people. You think about Yahoo had to notify, as part of the disclosure of this, 1 in every 7 people on this planet, they had to notify them that their data had been stolen. Now, one of the things that people in this room don't realize that many people who actually raised their hand, many people who didn't raise their hand may not even realize that they had a Yahoo account. Because when Yahoo is creating their accounts, you can use another account to create it. So you can use another email address, or you can use another account and so forth. Or you may be getting a service from another company. But in many cases, actually in the background, the Yahoo account is created and linked to that account. So you may use your regular account to access your email, or the service from Yahoo, or the financial data, or the stock, and so forth. However, the account in the back end is also functioning, and also that was the one that was disclosed. So you actually take that disclosed account and log into the same. And many people don't realize that that Yahoo account was created without you even knowing about it. So that's also, you may not even realize that you have a Yahoo account out there. So it might be worth actually searching. So one of the things I always call this a bit of a myth, is that many people kind of have this image of what a hacker looks like. We have this false portrayal of a kid sitting with a hood, in a dark room, hasn't slept in 48 hours and is like typing tons of code. We have this false image of what a really hacker is and what group that they belong to. And it's quite interesting. Of course, the media makes it out, and Anonymous has also contributed to a lot of that we have this image, and a lot of course TV series. If you're watching CSI Cyber, or you're watching what's the other one? The guy, whatever, Mr. Robot. Yes, we have this false pretense of what a hacker is. I would ask you to turn your head to your left and right, and a hacker is probably more like the person sitting next to you. So we have to get at this false image of that this is the hacker, and realistically, the real image that we have, and it's actually quite interesting, is that I know that we've got different categories of hackers, but the majority of hackers is probably around my age, look like me, and they have been in IT for quite a long time, and now younger kids are coming in taking their jobs, and they're kind of feeling a little bit, what am I going to do now? I've got all these skills that I've gathered up over the years. I can make more money doing cybercrime. So you have to get out of this false image that most hackers are actually around their mid-40s and 50s. They're actually a generation that's now basically looking at what's my next kind of path. Younger people, I can't get the job these days. I can't get in the workplace. I've got these skills. And they actually decide that, do they find a job or do they use that extra time that they have? Even retired people have all this time in their hands that they're looking for activities. And of course, we got the other side of the spectrum is youth. A lot of kids who are now searching and doing a lot of videos on YouTube and different types of online videos that are really simply teaching people how to hack. They want to take a career path. They want to get educated. They want to learn. They end up learning a lot of how to get themselves free things, and then that activity then moves into criminal activities, and then they start in the wrong side of the law. So I want to change your image about hackers and what they look like, because the image is wrong, and it's more like the person next to you. The other side of things is always important, and this is actually one that I get into quite a lot of discussions with law enforcement typically, is that we have different risk actors that we talk about time and time again. And it's important to know what's the motivation of those who participate in cyber activities or cyber crime. And of course, you've got, there's more categories to this you can get into a lot of detail. But of course, you've got the script kiddies. Then you've got organized crime, nation states, and terror groups. The problem is that most of the law enforcement today, they actually treat cyber crimes with one massive hammer, which is the terrorism hammer. And most time and time, again, it's the terrorism hammer that gets used against cyber crime. Unfortunately, it's not solving the motivational factor. That's one of the biggest issues. One of the things we actually have to change in this industry is that you have to actually not treat all of those with the same law and the same elements. They have to be treated differently. So therefore, one of the things, of course, terror groups, you have to treat the nature of intelligence and prevent destructive nature. And of course, the sharing of that information. Nation states, of course, and intelligence briefing. But organized crime, the motivation is financial. By using the same terrorism laws and financial motivation will not provide any solution long term. So we have to focus on preventing the actual mitigation controls for financial. And then, of course, script kiddies. We have to make sure that we educate and navigate them into doing the skills that they've learned maybe online or over time, and actually navigate them to actually using that for good causes. We have to solve the education problem. And if we solve the education problem, that will actually in turn solve cybercrime long term. We're not going to solve cybercrime in the next 5, 10 years. It's going to be through education and training. So some of the things you need to kind of be aware. So during my travels, I had a lot of conversations about ransomware. So ransomware is something that we're seeing significantly impacting many companies. Now with ransomware, I think you saw the news just recently, which I thought just to highlight, is that one hotel has been impacted by ransomware, where actually the ransomware infected the system that was controlling the key cards for all the hotel doors. So all the hotel guests could no longer access their room until the hotel paid ransomware. And we're starting to see ransomware moving into different platforms and different vectors. Previously, of course, it was very focused at traditional desktops, laptop systems, but we're really starting to see it move slightly and move and jump across platforms. Or even last year, we saw one of the transportation agencies in the west coast of the US being also impacted by ransomware, took out their actually scheduling systems. And also in the UK, one of the hospitals recently in October had a ransomware attack, and that actually made the hospital had to shut its doors for 2 days. They actually had to close the doors. The traumas, emergency procedures, doctors, surgeries, accidents, emergency rooms, they had to actually redirect all of the scheduled, planned, and traumas to other hospitals because their systems were non-functioning. You think about now, that's an indication that now we're in cybercrime, we're supposed to be monetary focused, and it still is heavily, that it's now having significant impact to potential life-threatening scenarios. It may be not the purpose of the cyber criminal to do that, but we're in the scenario where it has the potential of actually causing a life and death scenario. Now, it's important to know that for one of the first times last year, the US CERT and Department of Homeland Security issued a major update and warning to those. And of course, if you go through a lot of the recommendations that they've stated here, a lot of these will actually prevent ransomware. However, the shocking thing is that all of these recommendations and practices that's listed here, very few companies that I've visited have actually done, if any of them. And that's the sad thing, is that we know that we can prevent them, but sometimes we're very complacent actually doing anything to stop it. So, of course, you can go through the list here, having a backup. It's quite straightforward. One of the problems that people don't realize that you also need an offline backup because a lot of the ransomware cases that I worked on last year, the ransomware was actually had a timer. And what we found was that one company, we actually restored from the backup, put it back in production, and what happened a week later? The timer triggered and ransomware infected the system again. It was actually backed up into their backup. And they restored the ransomware from their backup to production, and a week later they're back in the same scenario again. So you also have to be aware into what type of ransomware you're being impacted to, and also make sure that your mitigation controls completely eliminate it, and not that you're actually going to restore back into the virus in your organization. So it's also important to know that. So backup is important, but it's also make sure that you actually back up wisely and make sure that you can restore it. Application whitelisting, this is something that I'm a specialist in, is making sure that you're only running the right applications. This is a great way at actually eliminating ransomware that untrusted or unknown applications do not run. Keeping your system up to date, patched, antivirus. Antivirus, I mean, okay, I came from Symantec for many years, and I had a good old colleague of mine one day state that antivirus is dead. And we can fast forward many years later. I can guarantee that, yes, antivirus is not dead, but it's no longer the only tool that will prevent you from getting infected. You still need to run it. It will still do an okay job, but it's no longer the only tool that will prevent you from getting infected. So it is now one of many, but it's not dead. It will be around for a while, but it's something that just be aware. This is the one I like the best here, is least privilege. Who here runs a least privilege model? Least privilege is one of the most important things to do. Because if you run on least privilege, everything that you execute or do or click on, if it tries to actually do anything to your system, whether it being encrypt or elevate privileges, you will see about it. If you're running as a higher level of privileged user all the time, every action you do will be masked or hidden in the background. So it's always important to get into the habit that you actually run an at least privileged model, because then every action you do will actually show you transparency to when something's trying to make changes to your system. And it gives you that warning that when you're browsing that website and you click on something or you open up attachment, that attachment or that link is actually doing something that may be damaging to your system. Other things as we saw last year, of course, was critical infrastructure and IoT. We've seen many instances, and I'd recommend talking to Michael and others who's had firsthand experience in these, of course, we're starting to see critical infrastructure being impacted by cybercrime. And of course, we had the US Department of Energy release their report. If you haven't read it, I recommend reading it. It's always good to get into other companies' scenarios where they can actually provide you what types of infections they had, what types of attacks. So they had over 1,000 attempted attacks in 4 years. They had 150 that were successful. Only 53 were classified as actually critically damaging. And those 53, guess what they had? They were a privileged account. They were actually administrator. They were root. The other ones had low-level, least privileged access, so they could not elevate and could not do any damage. And that's where they classified the differences. And of course, the Ukraine scenario where 80,000 plus homes were out of power. Then, of course, we had the fun DIN attack, which is one of the biggest DDoS. Now, I've had the pleasure over the years, a long career now, that I was part. If you haven't read, who's ever read the GRC report on DDoS? One person. Oh my God. Okay, we're similar age then. Everyone else is really young in this room. I recommend, if you get the opportunity, to read the GRC report on DDoS. I read it and I was participating in it. I was a secondary victim at the time. I was actually a victim of that attack, but a secondary one because we use the same ISP provider. And I highly recommend it. It is one of the most educational things that you'll read to really prepare you to understand about DDoS and effectiveness, and also how to actually do the investigation side. But DDoS is something that is going to be, for many organizations, very difficult to defend against. And my recommendation for DDoS is really decentralization. It is to be decentralized. Don't rely on single locations, single instances, single sites. To be really effective at DDoS, you do need to decentralize yourself, and that's one of the most effective measures. It's interesting that a distributed denial of service attack, the way to defend against it is to be distributed. So another area that I want to talk about is European General Data Protection Regulation. Some of you in the room mentioned you'd already been familiar with it. This is something that comes into enforcement in May 2018, so May next year, and it's going to be significant changes to a lot of companies, the way they operate and deal with data and so forth. So it's basically replacing the directive from 1995, and it comes into effect in 2018. And as I mentioned, the scenario that Tesco's would experience. Now, some of the actual principles that apply to this, of course, adequate, not excessive, it's collected for the intended use. So if you collect it for immigration, it can only be used for immigration. If you connect it for licensed vehicle information, it can only be used for that purpose. You cannot use it for other means, okay? So that's important to know. For the lawful process purposes, accurate and up-to-date, accountability, and kept secure. So many of the principles that apply to General Data Protection Regulation, we can talk a little bit more detail later. But in a summary, you have to get consent of the person you're actually getting the data from. You had to get their permission. You have to get their acceptance and authorization. You have to have a data protection officer, and this, of course, applies to different the size of organization as well. So you have to have somebody who then oversees how you collect and process data, and as you bring new systems on board to make sure they comply with the regulation as well. Data breach notification, 72 hours. You have to notify law enforcement if you have a breach within 72 hours. Legal obligations to notify without undue delay. This was a little change that they made between draft 2 and draft 3 in the final version. Originally it was 14 days, but due to data classification, they decided that it needs to be kind of more flexible. Data portability, right to rager. Joint liability for cloud is a big one because many organizations who are using cloud always kind of push the liability back to the cloud provider. Now there's joint liability. So if the hosting provider has a breach, you're joint liable for that. So some significant areas that we need to be aware of. So some of my top predictions for coming, so just a little bit of recap about last year and what I've experienced in the field. A little bit about my predictions for the coming year, what we're going to see, what's going to happen this year. So first of all, ransomware will increase and will move platforms. It will move across to many different devices, including IoT and smart devices. We will see ransomware become more cross-platform impactful. We will start to see things like you may be watching the Super Bowl in a few weeks, or you may be watching a soccer football game. You may be watching your favorite sport, or a new movie may come out. So you're sitting in your home, you're sitting back, you've got your friends, you've got your beers and your popcorn and stuff, and all of a sudden pops up on the TV. Would you like to continue watching this? It's only going to start in 1 minute. And you're like, what do I do? As my point is, this becomes very time sensitive. And also the purchasing mechanisms become very easy to do as well. So you can just click cancel or buy. Cancel, don't watch the game, go to your friend's house. Or you buy and spend a small fine or small fee for getting access. This will be the ransomware that we will start to see adopting. It will actually move platforms and actually get very time sensitive to the things that you want to do and become something that's easy also transaction-wise. Of course, the other ones would be is that many people, who has a camera on their home TV? Who's willing to say that they have a camera on their home TV? So, of course, many devices, and of course, all security professionals, we've got sticky tapes all over the place, covering every camera that we even find. However, many people have smart TV at home, and this is actually one of the areas that we've done a lot of compromising. TVs are very compromisable to the point where you can actually access the microphone and the camera. To the point where that your TV will take a picture of you in a maybe unsavory position or activity. And it will then say, okay, I just took a picture of what you just did. And we've actually had scenarios of this last year, but they were not ransomware specific, but we've had actually scenarios of this been happening where people have been doing webcam sharing and all of a sudden, cyberbullying and other types of activities. But who would be willing to pay this to get the photo deleted? So this is where you get into that time-sensitive scenarios. So be aware that these are the types of things that we're starting to see in development and coming out in the near future. Also, we will see a DDoS catastrophe this year. We will see another DDoS attack. The world is not, I think the world is a great place. I think it's, I don't see any bad things when I travel, even though a lot of people say that it's a bad place. I think it's a great place, and I think the people in it are fantastic. But with all of the scenarios that's happening is that we will likely see a major DDoS attack. It may be from a nation-state attack, but it also could be down to the kids who's sitting at home and all of a sudden gets unhappy because his PlayStation game is no longer functioning or whatever reason, and decides to go and trigger a mass DDoS attack because it's basically, as a service online, you can go and issue those. So we will likely see whatever the motivation is, whether it's the nation state or cybercrime or a kid who's unhappy with the game results, we will likely see something significant happen this year. Other things, of course, I mentioned a little bit about the GDPR. We will see industry regulations being really significantly pushed. We're kind of anticipating that the new presidency in the US will issue some new mandate or new initiative with cybercrime over the next kind of 3 months or so. We do have the NIST update. NIST standards in the US been updated later this year, so the drafts have been released, and of course the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU. We will see a lot of regulatory enforcements and initiatives going into cyber. Also, blockchain technologies will become a major influence into cyber defense and cyber integrity. I've been in a blockchain for many years now and doing a lot of innovation in blockchain. Was also spent a long time with GuardTime, who's a local company here in Estonia that deals with blockchain. But we will see blockchain's importance throughout this year and next. We've already seen a lot to do with things like voting systems, financial transactions, and fraud prevention. So we will see blockchain becoming very important and very valuable in the actual cyberspace in the coming year and years to come. We'll also see deception technologies. Who's familiar with deception technologies? A few people. I think it's quite surprising. Or maybe it's a kind of name. It was actually interesting in which deception originally came from things like honeypots. So if you're familiar with honeypots, it's something that I would have used years ago in the data centers. But then honeypots kind of came stagnant, didn't do any evolution or any innovation for a number of years. And then after 2007 Estonia, which is going to be the 10-year anniversary in April, of course, the big famous attack that happened in 2007 that most people should be aware of. As a result of that, then there was research into offensive capabilities in cyber, which is then known as cyber mines. And cyber mines has evolved into this deception. So deception is basically an active honeypot, which allows, so if I'm a hacker, I can tell you when I'm doing assessments or doing pen testing, that end up, if anyone's running deception, I have sometimes a 1 in 4 or a 3 in 4 chance of hitting a deception mine, which means that the chance of me being found is very high. So when I see deception, sometimes while you're using it, it can be a deterrent. So deception technologies are something that, of course, they're just innovating, they're becoming new. They are an evolution of honeypots, but they will be a very good mechanism that will help actually detect cybercrimes in the network much earlier. And also behavior analytics and reputation and also intelligence. We're starting to see a lot of innovation, a lot of analytics. A lot of this really is to help us visualize and see the data that's being collected and help understand about what actually is a real person, what's not a person. So this is going to be important. And I think that this is also going to be a major impact into a lot of the trends we're seeing around fake news. Probably about, we always say 95% of the internet is probably pornography and crime and other types of things. Probably about 95% of the internet is also fake news. So unfortunately, which means that a lot of people have to actually decipher what's real and what's not. Hopefully behavior analytics and reputation will be able to make that much more cleaner and much more transparent for that. So we will see a lot of innovation around that this year. And I guarantee in 3 weeks' time when I'm in San Francisco at RSA, that pretty much every vendor will have something around this and advertising it. And of course, cyber hygiene will be one of the important factors this year. As I mentioned at the beginning, what's the biggest factor, biggest cause of cybercrime? Is us. We are the biggest factor. And one of the biggest concerns I have is that I've been teaching in schools for the past, I think it's 4 or 5 years now, in Tagasi Kooli. So if whoever in the room is familiar with Tagasi Kooli, it's the ability for professionals to go back into school and teach kids about what it's like in the day-to-day world, what's it like in the workplace, things that they can pass on. And as part of that process, I actually thought that I was going to be going and teaching children. I thought I'm going to go and I'm going to actually provide a lot of education. I'm going to be, their advisor and make big changes. Well, I actually realized that actually they changed me. They taught me about, one is that yes, the next generation workforce and next digital natives, they're amazing, very talented, very excited and looking forward to what they can contribute in the future. However, their security hygiene is very, very bad. We look at them and we're like, oh, they can click on that iPad, they can move things around and stuff, and it becomes very, oh, they know how to do it. But in fact, their actually security is really bad. They choose bad passwords, they share it with their friends, they upload everything, and they basically are willing to talk to people that they don't know who they are on the internet. So it's important that we actually look at cyber hygiene. We do it as basically, we had to focus on it, we had to prioritize on it, we had to make sure it's a priority for this year, but we also have to emphasize that to children. We also have to pass it to the education system. Cyber hygiene should no longer be an option. It should be mandatory. It should be something that every school, every kid, and ourselves should be actually teaching the children at home. I can tell you now, the biggest thing that I've been finding when I'm doing my research is that cyber criminals are moving their target to children. Remember I said small businesses are the stepping stone to big corporations? Who's the stepping stone to you? It's your family and your kids. And it's easier to ask the child for their mommy's PIN card or password than it is to ask you. And they're willing to give it. And most of them know your phone PIN number, I can guarantee it. So it's important that cyber hygiene becomes a very important factor moving forward, and something that we really focus on and prioritize. And this is something that I think that, I can tell you now, some of the scenarios I've done, this has been the biggest difference between organization security improvements, by actually educating. We've made differences of actually reducing risk by more than 50% by just education and not making any actually technology changes. People are the best defense, the best perimeter, and the more they know, the more you become protected. So at that point, I'll open up if anyone has any questions. I know we're probably on the time right away. We're probably actually over. Okay, are we over? Yes, we are over. So at that point, I'll open up for one or two questions everyone has in the room, and then we'll break. And then afterwards, we're going to split the room into two, and therefore we'll then split the tracks. So at this point, anyone any questions they would like to validate on? Yes?
Do you happen to know if data brokering is legal in Europe, since we were talking about GDPR?
Data broking, it will actually come down to the consent. So when you're signing the consent side of things, that will then facilitate data brokering.
So if I agree, click on Facebook user, then
Yes, that's what you're doing, yes. And how many people read those terms and conditions? So, any other questions before we break? Hopefully this is kind of a good introduction and get you kind of in the mindset for today. And then hopefully after this, now you kind of get an idea what's happening in the internet, what's happening in the world, what trends are coming. And then hopefully the next sessions will give you that more kind of practical and more kind of knowledge to take things away. So thank you for the time today. Go and actually get connecting with the speakers, peers, and other people, and use this time to really get engagement, get a cup of coffee, wake up a little bit more, and then let's enjoy the rest of the session. So thank you. Thanks.